Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in once again to the Black Box Podcast. BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. Today we're still discussing the case of the Sodder Children, a mystery from back in 1945 when a house fire on Christmas Eve left a family without five of their children. And not only did they believe that five of the children were lost somehow, but not a single remain was found in the house that had been burned to the ground. Today we're going to be doing a little bit of devil's advocate. Now, I've been doing a series of podcasts on this channel talking about the case of the Sodder children. So, right now, I would just like to do a little bit of devil's advocate where we just sort of argue something kind of to the contrary. Let's argue the possibility that the Sodder children did not survive the fire and that they actually were reduced to ash completely and that all the sort of remains of the children were simply engulfed in the flames. Well, what supports this theory? I would say that the biggest thing that would support it is that we have multiple reports that there were flammable substances in the basement. Not only like coal, which George Sodder worked in the coal trucking business. I mean, he had a trucking business which mostly dealt with moving coal from place to place. But also, there was a report that there were oil drums in the house that could have accelerated the temperature and made the fire much hotter than normal. Now, I really do have to insist upon this, like when you sort of look at the temperature of what a crematorium it can be, a house fire can get that hot. I mean, house fires can exceed 1800 degrees if they have additives, combustibles, and wind. I mean, we really see this from arson cases. And furthermore, I mean, I think that's something rather interesting that we come across in a variety of true crime cases. Like, people are like, they're always, very fascinated with anomalies that are associated with fires. And also, there was this one case on Forensic Files of a woman whom they actually believed, opened a door during a house fire, and she was just hit with a kind of like an eruption of gas, and the gas knocked her unconscious. I mean, like, the fires can do crazy things. So, I mean, something like that could have happened to the Sodder children as well, that they could have been knocked unconscious, where they could have passed out because of fumes. That would explain why all children would have been in one place in the hottest possible zone. And the house, of course, would have also caved in and continued to smolder, well, for like additional hours, perhaps. So that could have reduced the bodies completely to ash. But if we stand away from things, because it's like, I'm not a forensic scientist. I'm just trying to give kind of, the most general layperson opinion on those things. If we could actually talk about some other things from the more social commentary perspective, no remain no sightings have ever been definitive. I mean, like, no sightings of the Sodder children have ever come back 100%. Whether it's the photograph of Lewis Sodder from Central City, Kentucky, whether it's the sightings in Texas, whether it's George Sodder seeing somebody in a magazine, whether it's the relatives in Florida, no sightings ever came back 100% conclusive. And it's like, we've also really talked about that all of these children would have had, memories of their families, especially Maurice, who was 14 at the time. It's not like he would forget his old life or something like that. I mean, Betty was age 6, and then that would even have a certain amount of gray area, but she probably wouldn't have forgotten them completely. So people really just weren't reaching out. Like, nobody is making any definitive attempts to reach out, like, I mean, like, after 20 years or something, you would think that they would perhaps still have some ability to contact, but no, I mean, the fact is, fact, no contact from any children ever. If they had ever survived the fire, no contact, no definitive contact, no, I mean, it's like, furthermore, all of the witness sightings are rather inconclusive. And I'm talking about the people who saw the arson to the house, because, yeah, I do believe it was an arson, but, they're saying that they saw a man throwing fireballs on the roof. One woman says that she saw a passing car that had multiple children in it. How do we really know what people saw? Like, like in true crime, we really find that eyewitness testimony isn't that convincing because people don't necessarily know what they're seeing, especially when they aren't forced to remember the events. Like, if you just see a passing car with children in it, I mean, how do you know that you're supposed to remember that later for part of an investigation? I mean, like, how do we really know that that's going to be important? So the human brain just has a horrible, horrible capability to remember precise details. And then we start, kind of adding in fictitious things sometimes because we want to create a pattern. So what we can say is all of the sightings of the children in the hours and days after the house fire are inconclusive. So some woman saw a person, in a restaurant with a group of children. They're talking in Italian or a language that she believes to be Italian. Well, what does that have to do with anything? How do you know that that's connected? Well, the short story is we don't know that that's connected. We don't know that there was any definitive sighting of the children ever, ever. And like we sort of touched on this subject in some of the previous podcast segments, but it's like if the children, were in this Italian American community that was so large that the mafia was involved and that people were, offended by George Sodder's comments about Benito Mussolini, then there are going to be other Italian American families in the western part of West Virginia. I mean, it's like there are going to be other Italian Americans living in that part of the state. So you saw a family speaking in Italian in a restaurant. Well, what does that mean? That doesn't mean, it doesn't prove anything at all. Now, when it comes to the photograph that was received that says Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, Lil Boys, and has the postal codes for Sicily on it, once again, it would really be nice if we could say with 100% certainty that that was indeed Louis Sodder, but we can't. I mean, we can't say with definitive certainty that that was indeed Louis. I mean, it would be very nice if we could, but we don't necessarily know what that is. And we talked about this a little bit before, but there is the possibility that people do just put out fraudulent information. I mean, like, someone might not even be doing it intentionally. They might genuinely believe that they are helping. They might genuinely believe that that person was Lewis. But the fact is, we don't know. So that's a question mark. Once again, no definitive sightings. Unconfirmed person in the photograph. It's like, also, all the witness sightings, are just not very, like, they're not very credible. So what we can just sort of say is, what is the pathway that makes the fewest amount of assumptions? Well, there were no remains found in the fire, but also the simplest thing is just that the children passed away and they perished in the burning house. I mean, it sounds horrible and gruesome, and it definitely sounds like not only arson, it sounds like also murder. I mean, if someone burns their house down, we have a person trying to steal the block and tackle who cut the phone line, and we also have someone saying that your house and your children are going to go up in smoke. Yeah, this was most likely an arson, which turned into a murder. But really, we have to look at just what is making the fewest amount of assumptions. There was a house fire. The children were never seen again. Okay, well, I mean, as horrible as it sounds, the bodies could have been reduced to ash. And once again, we've talked about a possibility that perhaps they passed out from the fumes and the gases, and all five children would have been in the hottest part of the house. And, like, that sort of like, we really have to recognize that in a house fire, the temperature isn't going to be constant. So you're going to have items that are going to be turning up, like a dictionary, the old coins. Those things might survive because they're in a different temperature zone. And the children were probably all just together. They probably just moved together because that's what a family does when they're in, a time of crisis, and they passed out from the fumes, and then the house caves in, the flames continue to smolder, and it just reduces the bodies 100% to ash. And I'm very curious, though, Jenny Sodder, the mother, conducted experiments for the rest of her life when she would have placed, bones in like burning flames to see if she could reduce them 100% to ash, and she never could, never 100%. Well, what I really want to know is what kind of additives was she using, what kind of combustibles, and how much wind. And furthermore, we really have to look for tainted variables in experiments, and it's like, I think the only way that she could ever properly test that if she were to set an entire house on fire that has coal and oil in the basement, and we could see what happened. Also, perhaps there were there were some larger remains that were just never found because George Sodder buried the house. He buried the area with a, like a bulldozer and dropped a bunch of soil, and perhaps there were, some pieces that just were not found. I'm very well aware that they tried to excavate the area, but they just did not find any remains. However, the lack of skeletal remains does not mean that the children didn't die in the fire. It just means that the fire was a lot hotter than other people are giving it credit for. And house fires can do that. We've seen quite a few arson cases on stuff like Cold Case and Forensic Files, and what happens is, the temperatures get a lot hotter in certain parts of the houses. Like the flames get pushed into certain areas. I mean, all of these things are possible. It's like all of these things are very, very possible, and they lead to very high temperatures in house fires that could reduce the bones to ash. Once again, a house fire can reach the temperature of a crematorium, and it's like, is that just what happened to the children? What I would really like to say is that it is possible as well that the family was really believing that their children were still alive because they couldn't accept the result. I mean, losing 5 children, and this most likely was an arson and a murder. Horrible, horrible. They probably couldn't accept the result, and I probably wouldn't if I were in their position. I can't imagine what George and Jenny Sodder would be going through. Not to mention their siblings, but what we would also want to bear in mind is just that there just is no definitive evidence that the children survived the fire. Another big point is, and I still don't understand, what would be the motivation to take the children out of the house but never contact the Sodder family? I mean, we've talked about this a little bit, and on well, it might have even been the Wikipedia page. They said that the family thought that they were later going to get some sort of claim of trying to extract money from the Sodder family, but that never happened. To the very least, to the best of our knowledge, that never happened. So, I mean, once again, what is the motivation to take 5 children out of a house just to move them away from their family, and just they grow up in different parts of the country or different parts of the world? What is the ambition with that? I mean, if we're going to have reports that Louis Sodder was working in Texas, or that the children were taken to Italy, or that they were, moving around with, a bunch of Italian mafia members, for what reason? I mean, like, why would they do this? And I don't really think the motivation is very clear in some of these things. I mean, like, if we're just going to try and paint sort of a picture, what is more likely? I mean, it's very sad to say, but the children just perished in the fire. It's like, we do have to recognize that just all of the evidence and sightings that supports anything associated with survival is theoretical, it is speculative, and it is not concrete. Even the photograph of Louis Sodder, that is not definitively him. We can use some sort of argumentation to say that that's Louis in the photograph, but that's not definitively him. We don't know what that is. And like, we also have, people who are probably going to have been aware of this case. And not to mention, they had that giant billboard up, for years. Like, we're talking decades. People would have had familiarity with the case, and I'm really tempted to think that there are people who perhaps had some knowledge of the case, and then they just kind of started giving the family false leads. It's very possible. I mean, it really is. Like, there was that one story that one of the Sodder children was living in a convent in Kansas or Missouri or wherever that was. Well, it's like, I don't know. To me, that just sounded like a bizarre, far-fetched story. Not to mention, we have all of these things that are going around where it's like, you do know that somebody just showed. I mean, like, we really believe that that was some guy trying to give George closure, and they sort of recognized that the family experienced a very terrible tragedy. So what is the answer? What is the thing that you're going to do? You're just going to try to do something to alleviate the suffering. And I think a lot of people would have been in that boat, and it's very possible that someone could have mailed that Louis Sodder photograph, just either genuinely believing that he was indeed Louis Sodder, or perhaps they just wanted to make the Sodders feel better. They wanted to sort of I don't know, kind of give them some hope or something like that. But we don't really know what that is. That means that there is no definitive physical evidence that the children survived the fire. Furthermore, it's like, if you have no evidence to support that, all of the evidence becomes assumptive. Everything that you can build up as in terms of argumentation and debate is just purely based on speculation and theorizing, as opposed to anything based on the hard concrete evidence. The only evidence that we really have is that there was a house fire, and that there was there were only four people that got out of the house. Sorry, that we're talking four children and two adults, Jordan and Jenny as well. Five children were not accounted for. And that's all we can really say. That is all that we have, with definitive certainty. They couldn't get five children out of the house. It would be such a different story if, say, for example, Jenny was like, oh, I saw Betty Sodder at the foot of the stairs walking out the door, and then she was never seen again. Nothing like that. The Sodders say nothing like that. All they can say is that one of the siblings woke up they woke up their siblings, when they were trying to get out of the house. No one is saying anything like, oh, I saw Louis Sodder walking down the road as the house was burning. I saw him walking in the opposite direction. We don't have anything like that. What we have are just very chopped up sentences that people sort of think are connected, like a woman saw a passing car that had children in it. A woman saw children sitting in a restaurant talking to a man in Italian. What does that mean? How does that prove anything? It doesn't. It actually doesn't. It's like no concrete physical evidence that the children survived the fire. Only theories and only assumptions. That tells us that this is just a horrible tragedy. It is a case of arson and it is a case of murder, but sadly, the children did not survive the fire. Well, that's my little bit of devil's advocate in favor of the Sodder children not surviving the fire and the likelihood of that. Overall, I'm very divided on it, and in reality, what I truly believe is just that I think it is the simplest explanation. I think it covers all the bases. I think it answers all the questions, and it uses the least amount of assumptions. However, I'm still not convinced, and then just to sort of give something from the heart, no devil's advocate right now, I think there is actually a bit of likelihood that the children did indeed survive the fire. I'm completely torn on this one. I don't think there's a lot of physical evidence to support it, and maybe through a little bit more investigation, we can try and work through some of the clues to get a more definitive answer. Perhaps, to know, are these witness sightings credible? I think that'll really help some things if we can find out if the witness sightings are credible, if the photograph of Louis Sodder is indeed him, and then we can discuss some more. But I'm hoping to do another Devil's Advocate segment soon about, the other side of the story. Did the children survive? Well, thank you so much for listening, and until next time.